Alma Brandt did not step off that train quietly. She stepped off like she owned the platform. 2 heavy suitcases in hand, a violin case strapped across her back, and a list of conditions folded in her coat pocket that no Montana rancher had ever been handed by a mail-order bride in his life. Henrik Carter stood at the end of that platform, expecting a woman who would be grateful. He got something else entirely, and nothing in 6 years of frontier silence had prepared him for her. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that train platform in 1882, because this is where everything begins. The letter had taken 11 weeks to arrive in Chicago. Henrik Carter had written it at his kitchen table on a Tuesday night in late February, his handwriting slow and deliberate, the way a man writes when he knows he is doing something that cannot be undone. He was not a man who asked for things easily. He had built his homestead outside of Billings with his own 2 hands, hauled every post dug, every well mended every fence line in Yellowstone County without asking a single soul for help. He had buried a horse survive 2 blizzards and watched his nearest neighbor pull up stakes and move east without once admitting that the silence was beginning to press on him like a stone. But that Tuesday night he sat down and wrote the letter. He kept it simple. He was not a flowery man, and he did not pretend to be. 35 years old, rancher, non-drinking, owns 300 acres, looking for a woman who is capable, willing, and quiet. Not educated beyond what is practical. Domestic skills preferred. Must be able to handle frontier conditions without complaint. He sent it to a placement agency in Milwaukee and waited. 3 months later, they sent him Alma Brandt. He would later say in his quieter moments that they had not warned him. He would say it the way a man says something he cannot fully explain, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of bewildered wonder that never entirely left his face when he looked at her. The Northern Pacific came through at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon in late May. Henrik had driven the wagon in from the homestead that morning, left before dawn, to make it on time, and stood at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, the way a man stands when he is more nervous than he wants to admit. There were 4 other passengers who stepped off the train, a traveling salesman, 2 brothers he recognized from a ranch south of town, and then her. She was not what he had pictured. He had not let himself picture much. He was a practical man, and practical men do not indulge imagination the way poets do. But whatever vague shape had occupied the corner of his mind, these past 11 weeks, it was not this. She was 30 years old, sturdy in the way of a woman who had worked hard her whole life with dark hair pinned back under a practical hat and eyes that moved across the platform the way a person's eyes move when they are cataloging everything they see. She carried 2 suitcases that looked heavy enough to make a dock worker reconsider, and across her back, strapped with a worn leather belt, was a long, narrow case that Henrik could not immediately identify. She spotted him before he spotted her. He knew because she was already walking toward him when his eyes found her, and she was walking the way a person walks when they have somewhere specific to be and intend to arrive there on their own terms. "Mr. Carter," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." He reached for one of her suitcases. She let him take one. Not both. "I am Alma Brandt." She said it the way a person states a fact that matters. "I have read your letter carefully. I have also prepared some terms of my own that I would like to discuss before we reach the property. Is the drive long?" Henrik looked at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. "'Bout 2 hours," he said. "Good." She nodded once, as if he had passed the first test without knowing it was being administered. "That should be sufficient." He got her bags into the wagon. She climbed up onto the seat without waiting for him to offer a hand, settled herself, and placed the narrow case across her knees. He walked around, climbed up, took the reins, and they pulled away from the platform into the wide Montana afternoon. He waited about 10 minutes before he could not stand it any longer. "What's in the case?" "A violin," she said. He looked straight ahead at the road. "I see. Does that concern you?" No, he said, though it did a little. Not the violin itself. Something about the certainty with which she had brought it. Good. She turned to look at the land on either side of them, and she did not look like a woman seeing the frontier for the first time and feeling small. She looked like a woman measuring it. How much of this land is yours? Starts about 4 miles out. Runs 300 acres. What is your water source? He glanced at her sideways. Creek on the north edge. Got a well near the house. Does the well hold through August? Always has. What is your soil composition near the south field? Henrik pulled his gaze from the road fully and looked at her for a long moment. She was watching the land. She had not looked at him when she asked it. Sandy loam, he said slowly. Why? Because it determines what will grow. She finally turned and met his eyes. Hers were direct and calm, in a way that he was not accustomed to in any one man or woman. I have some ideas about the cold frames. I read about a method on the train from a farmer in Wisconsin. Extends the growing season by 6 weeks. I wasn't... He stopped. I didn't ask for farming advice in the letter. No, she said evenly. You asked for someone capable. I am being capable. He faced forward again. His jaw worked slightly. She let the silence breathe for a moment then. How many neighbors are within a reasonable distance? The Halversons, 2 miles east, and the Connolly place, but they're 4.5 out. And the nearest library? He turned to look at her again, slower this time. The nearest? He stopped. Billings, where we just came from. How often do you make the drive? Once a month, maybe. She nodded thoughtfully, as if calculating something. That should be workable, she said. I can consolidate requests. He gripped the reins tighter. Not out of anger, he would think about this later and understand that, but because something in him was recalibrating, and recalibration for a man like Henrik Carter was not a comfortable process. They rode for another 1/4 mile before she spoke again. I would like to discuss my terms now, Mr. Carter, if you don't object. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Go ahead. She reached into her coat pocket and drew out a folded piece of paper. She did not unfold it. She held it on her lap with both hands, and Henrik got the distinct impression she had memorized every word on it, and the paper itself was only there to demonstrate that she had written them down deliberately. First, she said, my own room. I understand the house may not be large. I am not asking for luxury. I am asking for a door I can close. He kept his eyes on the road. There's a second room. I use it for storage. We can make arrangements for the storage. Fine. Second, a bookshelf. I have 12 books from Chicago. They require a proper shelf, not a floor or a windowsill. I can build a shelf. I am not saying it must be elaborate. Functional is sufficient. She paused. Third, and this is the most important, I retain the right to refuse anything, without being required to explain the refusal or justify it. I will tell you plainly when something does not suit me, and I am asking that you hear it as information rather than defiance. The wagon rolled through a low dip in the road and climbed back out. A hawk turned slow circles somewhere above them to the west. Most men, Henrik said, and his voice was careful and level, would take issue with that particular term. I am aware, Alma said, which is why I am presenting it clearly before we arrive, rather than discovering the conflict later. I find that transparency is more efficient than assumption. He thought about that for a long moment. The land opened out to the east in the way it did along this stretch, wide and flat, and edged by the blue shapes of far mountains and the sky above it all, the particular pale shade it turned in late May, before the summer heat set in proper. You always this direct? He asked. Yes, she said simply. Is it a problem? He thought about 6 years of silence. He thought about dinners alone and winters that lasted too long, and the sound of a house that never had anyone in it but himself. He thought about the letter he had written at that kitchen table in February, and how small and certain it had seemed at the time. No, he said. I reckon it ain't. She nodded. She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket, and that was that. She had been on the property for 4 days before Henrik fully understood what he had agreed to. She was up before him. Every morning. He was not a late sleeper. Ranch work cured a man of that permanently, but she was always already in the kitchen when he came out, and the fire was always already going, and there was always already something on the stove that smelled considerably better than anything he had managed in 6 years alone. The first morning, it was oatmeal with dried apples she had brought from Chicago. The second morning, soft-cooked eggs and black bread she had somehow found the ingredients for in his poorly stocked pantry. By the third morning, he stopped being surprised and started being grateful, which felt almost more unsettling. She cleaned the kitchen the second afternoon in a way it had never been cleaned before. Not just wiped down, but reorganized from the inside out. Pots moved dry goods, shifted the whole system of it, reconsidered and rebuilt, according to a logic that Henrik could not immediately follow, but found himself unable to argue with, because it was plainly more efficient. He came in from the barn to find her standing on a chair reaching into the top shelf of the cupboard, and she said without turning around, "Your tin goods are in the wrong order. Salt near the heat source was drawing moisture. I've moved everything. Is that acceptable?" He stood in the doorway. "You're asking now." She climbed down from the chair and dusted her hands on her apron and looked at him with that direct, calibrating gaze. "You're right. I should have asked first. Do you object to the new arrangement?" He looked at the kitchen. It looked like a different room, a better room. "No," he said. "I don't object." "Then we're aligned," she said, and turned back to the shelf. On the fourth day, she went out to the chicken coop. He was watching from the barn, without meaning to watch, doing something with a harness. He could have done faster if he had not kept glancing out toward the yard. She went in, came out, went back in, and when she came out the second time, she was carrying 3 boards under her arm and a hammer she had apparently located somewhere in the supply shed. He had been meaning to fix the northwest corner of that coop since March. She fixed it in 40 minutes. She came in for supper that evening with wood dust on her sleeves and something almost satisfied in the set of her mouth, and before he could say anything, she said, "The third board from the left was rotted through. I replaced it and reinforced the 2 on either side. You'll have fewer losses to the cold this winter." He looked at her across the supper table. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "My father had a farm outside Stuttgart," she said. "I was the oldest of 4 children. There was a great deal to learn and not enough people to learn it." She paused. "Is the soup all right?" "The rosemary may be too strong. I was not certain of your preferences." "The soup is fine," he said. And then, because it was the truth, and he was a man who dealt in truth even when it surprised him, "It's better than fine." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and something in her eyes shifted, not softened exactly, but opened just barely the way a door opens when the wind changes. "Thank you," she said. Not effusively, not with performance. Just thank you, and it meant something real. He had built the shelf by the end of that first week. He had not planned to do it so quickly. He had thought about it, measured the wall beside her window, put it off twice because he was busy, and because some part of him wanted to take his time with it, the way he took his time with things that mattered. But on Saturday morning, she was sitting at the small table in her room, reading one of her books, and the 11 others were stacked in careful piles on the floor because there was nowhere else for them. And something about that picture, those books on the floor, this woman reading in a room she had made as orderly as she could with nothing to work with, made him go out to the barn and come back with pine boards and get to work. She came out of her room when she heard the hammering. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment without speaking. "You don't have to do it today," she said. "I know," he said without turning around. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What kind of wood is that?" "Pine. Driest boards I had." "It will be solid." "I build things solid, Miss Brandt." He lined up the next board. "It's one of my terms." He heard a pause, and then something he had not yet heard from her, a small, quiet laugh. Not loud, not performative, just real. It lasted only a second, but it stayed in the room after it was gone, and Henrik kept his eyes on the boards and did not let himself smile, though it was a closer thing than he would have admitted to anyone. By the following evening, her 12 books were on the shelf. He saw them there when he walked past her door, organized in some order he could not determine from the hallway. He slowed without stopping. He could read the spines. Latin, German, something on botany, something on animal husbandry. A well-worn collection of poetry German by the look of it. A thick volume on European history. A smaller one on mathematics. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and thought about the letter he had written in February. Someone capable he had written. He stood at the stove and listened to the silence of the house, and for the first time in 6 years, the silence did not press on him the way it usually did. It was different now. It was the silence of a house where someone else was also quiet just a room away. And that he was beginning to understand was an entirely different thing. She played the violin that night after supper. She had not played it since she arrived. He had almost forgotten it was there, tucked in its case in the corner of her room. He was at the table with his ledger when he heard it, a slow, searching melody that he did not know the name of, something that started careful and built gradually and was neither sad nor glad, but somewhere in between, the way music sometimes reaches into a feeling that has no word and finds it anyway. He sat very still. He did not turn the pages of the ledger. He put his pencil down. He had not thought of himself as a man who felt music. He had not had occasion to find out. But he sat at that table in the lamplight and he listened all the way to the end, and when the last note faded and the house went quiet again, he sat for another long moment doing nothing. Then he picked his pencil up, turned the page, went back to the numbers. But the numbers felt different now too. Everything did a little. And that was the thing about Alma Brandt that Henrik Carter would spend the next 6 weeks slowly reckoning with. She had not changed anything exactly. She had just changed the air of the place. And a man could deny a great many things, but he could not deny the air he was breathing. He figured that out on a Thursday, 2 weeks in, when she argued with him about cattle. He had come in for the midday meal and made the mistake of mentioning in passing that he was considering a different rotation for the grazing, and she had set down her spoon and said quite calmly, "That may not be the most efficient approach." He looked at her. "Pardon, the eastern quarter," she said. "You said the soil there runs drier in July. Rotating the herd through it earlier in the season would reduce the strain on the grass when it's at its weakest. I read about the method from a rancher in Nebraska on the train from Chicago. He reduced his feed costs by roughly a quarter." There was a silence in which Henrik became aware that he was being advised by his mail-order bride about cattle rotation based on a conversation she had had on a train 3 weeks ago. "You read about ranching," he said. "On the train." "I read whatever is available," she said. On the train, it was a man who raised 1,200 head in Nebraska. He was quite generous with information. "You talked to a cattle rancher?" "At length, yes." She picked up her spoon again. "You may disagree with the method. I am not insisting. I am only saying that it seems worth considering." Henrik sat across from her. He thought about the letter. Quiet, it had said. Not educated beyond what is practical. He looked at her for a long moment, and then despite everything, he picked up his own spoon. "Tell me what the Nebraska man said," he said. And Alma Brandt set her spoon down again and told him with the kind of focused, ordered precision that Henrik was already beginning to recognize as entirely her own. He listened. He asked 2 questions. She answered both without hesitation. He ate his soup. She ate hers. Outside the window, the Montana afternoon went on being vast and bright and indifferent the way it always did. But inside that kitchen, something was tilting. Very slowly, very quietly. Both of them could feel it, and neither of them yet could say what it was. The cattle rotation worked. Henrik did not say so immediately. That was not his way. But 3 weeks after Alma had laid out the Nebraska rancher's method over midday soup, Henrik quietly shifted the herd's pattern east, and by the end of June, the grass in the south quarter was holding stronger than it had in 2 previous summers. He noticed. He said nothing. But he noticed. Alma noticed that he noticed, and she said nothing either. That was the particular language they were developing, a whole conversation conducted in silences, and small adjustments in kettles put on before the other person asked, and tools returned to exactly where they had been found. It was not warmth yet, not exactly. But it was something. A careful, deliberate something that both of them tended without naming. It was the Halverson visit that cracked the first real fault line between them. Martha Halverson came on a Wednesday morning in late June, driving herself in a small trap with a jar of preserved plums and the particular expression of a woman who had been curious for 3 weeks and had finally found sufficient excuse to act on it. She was a broad, good-natured Norwegian woman of about 50, and she arrived with the cheerful directness of someone who considered herself a neighbor in the fullest sense of the word. Henrik was out at the fence line when she arrived. Alma received her at the door. "You must be the bride," Martha said, and her eyes moved over Alma with the swift, assessing warmth of a woman who genuinely wanted to like what she saw. "I am Alma Brandt," Alma said. "Please come in." Martha came in. She sat at the kitchen table. She accepted coffee, and then she began to talk, which she did with the comfortable ease of someone who had been doing it successfully for decades. She talked about the county, about the winter past, about her husband Eric's bad knee, about the spring planting, about a dance that was being planned at the church hall in Billings for the 4th of July. "You'll both come, of course," Martha said. "It's the best thing that happens out here all summer. Everyone comes. The Connollys, the Birch family from north of town, the Abernethy girls." She paused, and her expression shifted slightly, as if she had caught something she had not intended to say. "Well, most everyone." "Who are the Abernethy girls?" Alma asked. Martha wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Ruth and Clara Abernethy. Their father has a spread about 6 miles north of here. Ruth is the elder. She's—" Another pause. "She and Henrik were friendly some years back, before you came." Alma held her coffee cup and looked at Martha steadily. "Friendly," she said. "It was nothing settled," Martha said quickly. "Ruth had ideas perhaps, but Henrik never. He kept to himself mostly. You know how he is." She stopped. "Well, you're getting to know how he is." Alma said, "Yes, I am." The visit ended pleasantly enough. Martha left her plums and her warmth and her carefully incomplete sentences, and Alma stood at the door watching the trap roll back down the road and felt something she did not have a precise English word for. German had one Ahnung, a sense of something coming that has not arrived yet. A shadow before the cloud. She did not mention Martha's visit at supper. Henrik, who had come in from the fence line and washed up and sat down to the meal she had prepared, did not ask about it. He could see from the set of her shoulders that something had shifted, but he was a man who had built his entire adult life on the principle of not pressing things before they were ready. So he ate his supper and passed the bread without comment. It was Alma who finally spoke. She did so without looking up from her plate. "Who is Ruth Abernethy?" The question landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Henrik set down his fork. He picked it up again. He put it down a second time. "Martha came," he said. "She did." Alma looked up now. "She was kind. She brought plums." "Ruth is a neighbor," Henrik said carefully. "Her family has land north of here." Martha suggested she had some expectation regarding you. Henrik met her eyes across the table. His were careful in the way of a man who is choosing every word with the awareness that the wrong one will cost him. "Ruth had notions," he said. "I never encouraged them. I was not looking for what Ruth wanted." "What was Ruth wanting?" He was quiet for a moment. "A house?" he said finally. "Children. The ordinary things. But she wanted them a certain way. She wanted—" He stopped and started again. "She wanted someone who would agree with her. About most things. I ain't much of an agreeing man, Miss Brandt, when I think the other way is better. We didn't suit." Alma looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight sat steady between them. "And yet you wrote to an agency," she said quietly, "for someone who would be quiet and agreeable." He held her gaze. "I wrote what I thought I wanted," he said. "I'm beginning to reckon those ain't always the same thing." Something in Alma's expression moved barely. She picked up her fork. She ate. He ate. The kitchen settled back into its particular silence, but it was a different silence now, thinner, more alive, the kind that vibrates slightly if you hold your breath and listen. She went to her room after supper. He heard the violin 20 minutes later, and this time the melody was something quicker, something with more argument in it, and he sat at his ledger and let it fill the house and did not pretend to read the numbers. The 4th of July dance came on a Friday, and Henrik told her 3 days before that she did not have to go if she did not want to. Alma looked at him over the kitchen table, where she was mending one of his shirts with the neat, decisive stitches of a woman who does not mend things halfway. "Are you telling me not to go?" she asked. "No," he said quickly. "I'm telling you the choice is yours." "Then I will go," she said. "I would like to see the county." He nodded once and went back to his boot. She wore the gray dress she had brought from Chicago, the better of the two she owned, and she pinned her hair up with a precision that Henrik noticed from across the room when she came out that morning, and immediately looked away from back to the horses. The ride to Billings took the better part of 2 hours. They talked in their usual way, practical things, the state of the north fence, whether the creek level was dropping faster than normal for this time of year. But there was something underneath the practicality, something both of them were aware of, and neither of them touched it. The church hall was already loud and lit when they arrived. Someone was playing a fiddle. There were perhaps 60 people crowded into the space, and the noise and heat of them hit Alma like a wall when she stepped inside, not unpleasantly, but with force. Martha Halverson found them within 2 minutes. "You came? Both of you, look at that." She took Alma's hands in both of hers and squeezed them as if they were old friends. "You look lovely. Henrik, doesn't she look—" She stopped herself. "Come, I'll introduce you to everyone." Everyone was willing to be introduced. Alma moved through the room with the same steady, observant quality she brought to everything, listening, measuring, responding with the kind of direct warmth that was different from the practiced social warmth most people deployed, and therefore more noticeable. 2 women her age pulled her into conversation about the cold frames she'd mentioned to Martha, and did not let her go for 20 minutes. Henrik watched her from across the room. He had a drink in his hand that he was not much touching. He was aware of himself watching, which was unusual, and he was aware of what he was watching for, which was more unusual still. She was entirely at ease. Not performing ease, actually at ease in the way of someone who finds people genuinely interesting rather than socially necessary. She laughed once at something the taller of the 2 women said, and it was the same laugh he had heard that day in the cabin when he'd said a shelf was one of his terms, real and brief and entirely unperformed. "She ain't what you ordered." The voice came from beside him, and Henrik turned to find Tom Abernethy standing at his left shoulder, a glass in his own hand, with the particular expression of an older man who has decided to say the difficult thing because he considers it his right. He was a large, weathered man in his 60s, and his gaze was fixed on Alma across the room, with an assessment in it that Henrik did not entirely like. "No," Henrik said evenly. "She ain't." "Ruth thought it was funny," Tom said. "When we heard, mail order from Chicago." He paused. "German, someone said." "That's right." "She looks capable enough." Tom took a slow drink. "But capable and settled are different things. Foreign women sometimes get ideas about how things ought to run." Henrik looked at the man beside him for a moment. "She does have ideas," he said quietly. "They're mostly better than mine." Tom Abernethy turned to look at him. Henrik looked back. Something passed between them that was not quite a challenge but was not entirely not one, and then Henrik shifted his eyes back to Alma across the room, and Tom drifted away. And that was the end of that. Ruth Abernethy found Alma before the dancing started. Alma was standing near the refreshment table with a glass of lemonade when a woman of about 32 appeared at her side, pretty in a studied, careful way, with light hair and the kind of composed expression that takes real effort to maintain. She introduced herself with flawless social grace, and a smile that arrived one beat too late to be spontaneous. "You're Henrik's wife," Ruth said pleasantly. "Not yet formally," Alma said. "We are in arrangement." She had learned this American ambiguity was the most accurate available description of their situation. Of course, Ruth's smile held. "He's a good man. Private. Stubborn." She paused. "He takes some understanding." "Most people do," Alma said mildly. Ruth looked at her directly for the first time, and some of the composed pleasantness slipped just enough to show what was underneath it. Not malice exactly. Something more honest than malice, and therefore sharper. "Do you find it lonely?" she asked. "Out there. It's very far from everything." Alma considered the question as she always considered things genuinely without social deflection. "It is far," she said, "but lonely is a different thing from far. I have not been lonely." Something crossed Ruth Abernethy's face, then brief and unguarded, and Alma recognized it, because she was a woman who paid attention and because she had not been born yesterday. It was loss. Real quiet private loss. Ruth Abernethy had wanted what Alma had, and she had not gotten it, and she was standing in a church hall in Billings pretending she had not wanted it, and she was not quite succeeding. Alma felt something unexpected then. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Sorrow, the kind that comes when you understand something about another person that they would not want you to understand. "It was good to meet you," Alma said quietly. And she meant it exactly as she said it. The fiddle had started up properly by then, and the dancing began, and Henrik appeared at Alma's elbow with the expression of a man who has arrived at a decision he is not entirely comfortable with. "Would you—" He stopped, started again. "I ain't much of a dancer." Alma looked at him. "Neither am I," she said. Which was not entirely true. She had danced at festivals in Stuttgart as a girl, but she said it because it seemed like the kinder thing, and she saw in his face that it was. They danced badly and deliberately at the outer edge of the floor, and neither of them spoke much, and it did not matter. It was on the ride home long after midnight that the night's biggest shift came. They were 2 miles out from Billings, the horses moving slow in the dark, the stars doing what Montana stars did in July, filling the whole sky from edge to edge until it seemed impossible that the world was anything but enormous and silent and full of cold light. Henrik said out of nowhere, and in the quiet voice of a man who does not say things like this often, "You handled Abernethy well." Alma turned to look at him. "Which Abernethy?" "Both of them." He kept his eyes on the road. "Tom said something to me about foreign women getting ideas about how things ought to run." "And what did you say?" "I said your ideas were mostly better than mine." She was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved through the dark. "You said that to him." "It's true," he said simply. "I try to say true things." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. He was not looking at her. He was watching the road, his profile set and steady against the pale scatter of stars behind him. And he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent 6 years alone and had not learned yet how to look at people when he said things that mattered. "Henrik," she said. She had not used his first name before. She had been careful about that. He turned to look at her. "Thank you," she said. He held her gaze for one long, steady moment. Then he faced forward again and adjusted the reins, and the horses kept on, and the Montana night spread itself enormous and quiet all around them, and between the two people sitting side by side on that wagon seat. Something that had been carefully suspended finally quietly began to settle into place. Alma folded her hands in her lap. She did not speak again for a long time, but there was something different in the way she held herself for the rest of the ride home, less careful somehow, less braced, as if something she had been carrying at a slight distance from herself, holding out at arm's length, the way you hold something you are not yet sure you trust, had been allowed to come just a little bit closer. They got back to the homestead near 2 in the morning. Henrik unhitched the horses. Alma went inside and lit the lamp in her room, and when the lamp went out 20 minutes later, Henrik was still in the barn doing the small unnecessary tasks of a man who needs to keep his hands busy while his mind catches up with what his heart has already figured out. He moved slowly in the lantern light, straightening things that did not need straightening, checking on horses that were perfectly fine, staying in the place where the work was familiar and the feeling was not. He was not ready to name what was happening. He was a practical man. He dealt in what he could see and measure and hold. But even a practical man standing alone in a barn at 2 a.m. in July in Montana has to admit that something that started in one direction can turn. Henrik Carter, after a very long time, turned down his lantern and walked back to the house. He did not sleep well that night. Henrik lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him, the way old timber does in the small hours, clicking and breathing. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular with the focused intensity of a man thinking about something very particular indeed. He did not name it. He was not ready to name it. But it was there in the room with him in the dark, as real and patient as the mountains. He was up before dawn. He had the coffee on before he heard her door open. She came out in the gray light of early morning, with her hair down, which he had not seen before. She stopped when she saw him already at the stove, and for just a moment, one unguarded, undefended moment, she looked startled. Then she reached up and began pinning her hair back with the swift, practiced efficiency of a woman re-establishing the appropriate order of things. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. He poured her coffee without being asked. He set it on the table at her usual place. She sat down and wrapped both hands around it, and he went back to the stove, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence they had yet managed together, which told him something. He put the information aside to deal with later and focused on the eggs. The trouble began 11 days after the dance. It started small, the way the worst troubles always do. Not with a crack, but with a hairline barely visible, the kind you only see when you're looking closely, and by then it's already gone deeper than you thought. Martha Halverson drove out on a Tuesday with something different in her face. Not the warm, bustling energy of her first visit. Something tighter. She came to the door and asked for Henrik, not Alma, which told Alma immediately that whatever Martha had come to say was something she had decided was a man's business, and that decision alone was enough to make Alma set down the bread she was kneading and dry her hands deliberately on her apron. Henrik came in from the yard. He and Martha spoke in low voices in the doorway, but the house was not large, and Alma had excellent hearing. She heard the words, "water rights." She heard the name Calhoun. She heard Martha say in a voice gone flat and serious, "He's been talking to the county recorder, Henrik." Eric heard it from Bill Pierce at the feed store. "Calhoun's claiming the creek survey was wrong. He's saying the North Branch runs through his property line, not yours." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room corner to corner. "That ain't right," Henrik said. His voice was very quiet. "I got the survey papers, filed in '79. "I know it," Martha said. "But Calhoun's got a lawyer coming from Helena. That's what Bill heard." Alma heard Henrik exhale a long, controlled breath, the sound of a man who is keeping something very still inside him. She heard him thank Martha. She heard the door. She finished drying her hands and went back to her bread, and was kneading it with strong, steady strokes when he came back into the kitchen. He stood in the middle of the room. "I heard," Alma said before he could decide whether or not to tell her. He looked at her. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Which was unusual. Henrik did not sit in the middle of the day. "The creek's my water source," he said. "The North Branch runs through the top of my property and feeds the well. If Calhoun gets a court to say that water's his—" He stopped. "The ranch dies," Alma said. "Yes." She kept her hands moving in the dough. She did this when she thought kept her hands busy so her mind could run free. "Who is Calhoun?" she asked. "Gerald Calhoun. He's got a spread east of the Halversons. New money came out from Pennsylvania 2-3 years back. Been buying up parcels wherever he can get the price low enough." Henrik rubbed one hand across his jaw. "He made me an offer on this place last fall. I told him no. And now he's moving to take the water. That'd be his way," Henrik said. "Make it uninhabitable without having to buy it. Wait for a man to give up and sell cheap. His voice was still level, but there was something beneath it now, a vibration low and controlled, like something that has been very tightly wound. Alma stopped kneading. She turned around. "Where are your survey papers?" He looked at her. "In the strongbox, under the bed." "Get them," she said. He got up. He came back with a flat tin box and set it on the table. She wiped her hands fully clean and sat down across from him, and he opened the box and spread the papers between them, and they sat together over those documents for the next 2 hours. Alma asking sharp, specific questions. Henrik answering them, both of them, following the lines of the survey map, with their fingers cross-referencing dates and boundary descriptions, and the language of the original county filing. At the end of 2 hours, Alma sat back in her chair and said, "The survey is clear. The language is not ambiguous. The North Branch is defined by the eastern stake at the Cottonwood Grove, which puts it entirely within your property line by approximately 40 yards. "I know it is," Henrik said tightly. "Then Calhoun's lawyer is either incompetent or dishonest," she said. "Both are manageable. What you need is someone who can read these documents in front of a county judge and make that argument clearly and without error." Henrik looked at her. "I can't afford a Helena lawyer." "No," she agreed. "But I can read Latin, German, and English. I have studied land contract language extensively, and I have spent the last 2 hours reading your survey documents." She held his gaze steady. "I am not a lawyer, but I am organized, precise, and I do not become flustered under pressure. Let me help you prepare." He stared at her for a long moment. "Alma." "Henrik." Her voice was calm and direct, and left no room for the particular brand of stubborn masculine pride that she could see gathering in him like weather. "This is your land. I live on it too. Let me help." He closed his mouth. He looked at the papers between them. He looked at her, and then he said quietly, "All right." What followed was 2 weeks of the most concentrated work either of them had ever done together. Alma organized everything. She made a chronological record of every document in the tin box, dated and cross-referenced. She wrote out the boundary description in clear modern language alongside the original survey text. She drafted a point-by-point account of the water usage going back to Henrik's first year on the property, when the well had been dug, what volume the creek ran at different seasons, the names of neighbors who had witnessed the original staking. She asked Henrik questions every evening at supper, and he answered them with the precision of a man who built things carefully and remembered every detail of what he had built. She wrote everything down. She cross-checked. She argued with herself on paper, writing out every counterpoint Calhoun's lawyer might make, and then writing the answer to it. Henrik watched all of this with the quiet, steady astonishment of a man who has misjudged the depth of something and is only now beginning to see how far down it goes. One evening, 10 days into the preparation, he came in from the barn to find her at the table with 3 candles burning because the light was failing, and she had not noticed, surrounded by papers, writing quickly in the small, decisive hand she used when she was working. He lit the lamp without being asked. She looked up. "You've been in here since noon," he said. "I know." She sat back and pressed one hand to the back of her neck, rolling it slowly. "I want to have the boundary argument finished tonight. The county hearing is in 9 days. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. He came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her papers and sat down across from her. She picked it up without looking, drank, and went back to writing. He sat with his own cup and watched her work and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the coffee had not already said better. After a while, she put her pen down. She looked at what she had written. She looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "When Calhoun made his offer last fall," she said carefully, "what did he say exactly? What words did he use?" Henrik was quiet for a moment. "He said the land was going to be trouble. That the county was going to change some of the old survey records. He called it a correction project. Said I'd be better off taking his price now before the corrections made things complicated." Alma was very still. "He told you the surveys were going to be corrected," she said slowly. "That's what he said. Before any legal proceeding had been filed." "Yes." She picked up her pen. "Henrik," she said, her voice dropping to something quiet and extremely controlled. Calhoun knew about this action before it was publicly filed. He told you about survey corrections before any such corrections had been publicly proposed. That means one of two things. Either he is the one driving the corrections, or he knows who is. Henrik set down his coffee cup. The sound of it touching the table was very precise in the quiet room. "That ain't just a land dispute," he said. "No," Alma said. "It is not." She wrote for another 3 hours that night. He stayed at the table with her for most of it, not talking, not reading. Just present in the way that a man is present when he understands that something serious is happening and wants the person doing the serious work to know she is not alone while she does it. It was close to midnight when she finally set her pen down and pressed both palms flat on the table and said, "I think we have it." Henrik leaned forward and looked at the pages she had assembled. He was not a fast reader. He had taught himself from a limited set of books, and the process was still deliberate. But he read slowly and carefully what she had written, and by the time he reached the last page, his jaw was set, and his eyes were very clear. "This is good," he said. And then, with the weight of a man who does not say things like this casually, "This is very good, Alma." She looked at him. Something moved in her face, not pride, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something warmer. The recognition of being seen doing something real. "We still need a witness," she said. "Someone who was present when the original stakes were set." "Old Pete Birch," Henrik said immediately. "He helped me survey the north edge in '79. He's still on his place. I can ride out tomorrow." "Go in the morning," she said. "Early." "I will." He stood. He gathered a few of the papers into a careful stack. He paused before he turned away. "I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "When I wrote that letter, to the agency, I was thinking about someone to cook and keep the house." Alma watched him steadily. "I wasn't thinking about this," he said. He gestured a small, insufficient gesture toward the table, the papers, the candles, the whole 2 weeks of it. "I didn't know to think about this." She held his gaze for a moment. "What are you thinking now?" she asked quietly. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has fought himself for weeks and lost. "That I was wrong about what I needed," he said, "and very lucky about what I got." She held very still. The candles moved slightly in some current of air neither of them felt. And then she said in a voice that was steady and real and entirely her, "Go to bed, Henrik. You have an early ride." He nodded. He turned away. He was at the door to the hallway when she said his name. He stopped. "I am glad the train went to Montana," she said, "and not somewhere else." Somewhere. He did not turn around. He stood at the door for one long moment, and she could see from where she sat the particular stillness of a man who has just been handed something he did not know he had been waiting for. His hand found the doorframe. He held it. Then he said quietly, "So am I." He went to bed. She sat alone at the table for a long while after her hands folded on top of the papers, listening to the house around her, the timber settling the wind past the window, the small sounds of a place that was beginning slowly and without ceremony to become hers. She had not been looking for this. She had boarded that train in Chicago with her 2 suitcases and her violin and her 12 books and her list of non-negotiable terms. And she had not been looking for anything beyond a workable arrangement with a practical man in a place far enough from the things that had not worked out to let her begin again. She had not been looking for Henrik Carter. She picked up her pen. She looked at the county hearing documents. She set the pen down again. Outside somewhere on the north edge of the property, the creek ran over its stones in the dark, the way it always did, following the boundary line that Henrik had staked in 1879, running through the land that Calhoun intended to take, and that Alma Brandt, 30 years old and 4 weeks in Montana, had spent 2 weeks building the argument to keep. She blew out the candles. She went to bed. In 9 days, they would stand in front of a county judge and find out what all of it was worth. She was not afraid. She had never been much afraid of the things she could prepare for. It was only the things that arrived without warning, the things you did not know, to prepare for the things that came on a train and walked toward you down a platform, already knowing your name, that had the power to undo her. And that particular thing had already happened. It had happened 40 yards north at the Cottonwood Grove, in a boundary line she could have drawn from memory. It had happened at a table full of papers and 2 cups of coffee, and a man who stayed up with her, not because she asked him to, but because he wanted to be in the same room while she worked. Alma Brandt pulled her quilt up and closed her eyes. In 9 days they would fight for the ranch. But tonight, lying in the dark in the room with the pine bookshelf and the 12 books and the door she could close, she understood that the thing she was actually fighting for was already here, already real, already more than she had written down on any list. She was not entirely sure what to do with that. But she was a practical woman, and she intended to figure it out. Pete Birch said yes. Henrik rode out at first light and came back by mid-morning with the old man's word and a handshake that meant more in Yellowstone County than most written documents. Pete was 71 years old, walked with a cane, and had a memory so precise it was almost unnatural he could recall the exact morning in August of 1879, when he and Henrik had set the eastern stake at the Cottonwood Grove, what the weather had been, which direction the wind was running, and the name of the county recorder who had signed off on the paperwork 3 days later. Alma had all of it written down before Henrik had finished unsaddling his horse. The hearing was set for a Thursday. They drove to Billings together the night before and took a room at the boarding house on Front Street, 2 rooms separate, which Henrik arranged without being asked, and which Alma noted with the quiet internal precision she applied to everything Henrik did that told her something true about him. She did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow boarding house bed and went through the argument from beginning to end 3 times the way she had done every night for the past week. The boundary description, the 1879 filing date, Pete Birch's testimony. The most important piece, the detail she had not yet told Henrik she intended to use the thing Calhoun had said last fall about survey corrections. The thing he should not have known to say. She had built the argument around that single fact the way you build a wall around a cornerstone, everything else supporting it, holding it in place, making it impossible to remove, without the whole structure coming down. She hoped it was enough. She was fairly certain it was enough. But certainty out here had a way of arriving only after the fact. Henrik knocked on her door at 6 in the morning. "Alma, you awake?" "Yes." "There's coffee downstairs." She was dressed and at the door in 4 minutes. He looked at her when she came out, a quick sweeping look that took in everything and then moved away, the way his looks always moved away, before she could fully read them. He handed her a biscuit wrapped in cloth that he had gotten from somewhere, and they went downstairs together and drank their coffee standing up because neither of them wanted to sit still. The county courthouse was a 2-story wooden building 2 blocks from the boarding house. They arrived early. Calhoun was already there, standing outside with his Helena lawyer, a thin, precise man in a good coat, who carried his briefcase with the air of someone who had won in rooms like this before and expected to do so again. Calhoun himself was heavier than Henrik Older, with the comfortable solidity of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted by the simple application of money and patience. He saw Henrik and nodded. He did not look at Alma. That, she noted, was his first mistake. Inside the hearing room held perhaps 30 people, neighbors, curiosity seekers. Eric Halverson, sitting in the 3rd row with his hat on his knee and his jaw set in solidarity. Martha was beside him. She caught Alma's eye and pressed her lips together in the tight, urgent way that meant she was afraid, but was not going to say so. The judge was a compact man named Harlan Pruitt, who had the demeanor of someone who had been listening to land disputes for 20 years and had lost his capacity for patience with dishonesty somewhere around year 3. He called the hearing to order, stated the matter, and looked over his spectacles at Calhoun's lawyer, with the expression of a man prepared to be either persuaded or annoyed. Calhoun's lawyer went first. He was good. Alma sat beside Henrik at the small respondents' table and listened with her hands folded and her face still, and she gave him full credit in her mind for being good. His argument was constructed carefully. His language was precise. He had a redrawn survey map on a board that placed the north branch of the creek 4 inches to the west of where Henrik's 1879 documents said it ran, and he presented it with the confident ease of a man who has prepared thoroughly. The county recorder, who had supposedly authorized the correction, a man named Aldous, whom Alma had not previously encountered, sat in the second row and nodded at appropriate moments. When the lawyer finished, Judge Pruitt looked at Henrik. "Mr. Carter, you're representing yourself." "Yes, sir," Henrik said. And then he did the thing that they had agreed on the night before, the thing that Alma had argued for quietly and specifically. "I'd like to allow Miss Brandt to present our documents, Your Honor. She's organized them." Pruitt looked at Alma. His expression shifted slightly, not quite surprise, but an adjustment, a recalibration. "Miss Brandt." He looked at the papers she was setting in front of her with careful efficiency. "Proceed." She stood. She did not look at Calhoun's lawyer. She did not look at Calhoun. She looked at the judge with the direct, steady gaze of a woman who has spent 2 weeks preparing for exactly this moment and is not going to waste a second of it. "Your Honor," she said, "the claim before you rests entirely on the validity of the survey correction filed 6 weeks ago by the county recorder's office. I would like to begin there." She presented the original 1879 survey, first the language of the boundary description, the dated filing, the recorder's signature. She walked through it methodically, pointing to the language that defined the eastern stake at the Cottonwood Grove, the 40 yards of margin it created, the unambiguous placement of the north branch within Henrik's property. She spoke clearly and without rushing, and the room was very quiet. Then she called Pete Birch. The old man rose from the front row with his cane and the dignity of someone who has been honest his entire life and knows exactly what that is worth. He confirmed every detail: the date, the weather, the stake placement, the recorder's name. Calhoun's lawyer objected twice. Pruitt overruled him both times without looking up from the documents. And then Alma said, "Your Honor, I would like to address the question of how this correction came to be filed." The room shifted. She felt it a collective tightening, the particular attention of people who sense that something is about to change. She turned to Henrik. "Mr. Carter, please tell the court what Mr. Calhoun said to you when he made his offer on the property last October." Henrik stood. His voice was level and clear. He repeated Calhoun's words exactly as he had said them to Alma at the kitchen table, the warning about the survey corrections, the advice to sell before things got complicated. He said them without embellishment or heat, the way a man recites a fact, and they landed in the room with the weight of something that had been dropped from a considerable height. Calhoun's lawyer was on his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, this is—" "Sit down," Pruitt said, still looking at Henrik. He took off his spectacles. He put them on again. He looked at Calhoun. "Mr. Calhoun, you told Mr. Carter the surveys were going to be corrected before any such action was publicly filed." Calhoun shifted in his chair. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. "My client." "I'm speaking to your client," Pruitt said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Alma had ever heard. She watched Calhoun's face do something she had seen before in men caught in the space between a lie and the truth, a rapid internal calculation, an attempt to find the door that was no longer there. His eyes moved to the county recorder in the second row. Aldous, who had been nodding so comfortably through the lawyer's presentation, was now very still. "That connection," Alma said quietly, filling the silence before Calhoun could find a way through it, "between Mr. Calhoun's prior knowledge of the correction and the subsequent filing by the county recorder's office is something Your Honor may wish to consider when evaluating the validity of that correction." Pruitt looked at her. He looked at Calhoun. He looked at Aldous. He picked up his pen and wrote something. "This hearing," he said, "is continued pending an investigation into the filing process of the survey correction in question. Mr. Carter's 1879 survey documents are entered as evidence. Mr. Carter, your water rights remain undisturbed by this court pending the outcome of that investigation." He looked over his spectacles at Calhoun's lawyer. Counsel, I'd advise your client not to take any action regarding that creek in the interim. He brought his gavel down once clean and final, and that was that. The room exhaled. Eric Halverson said something in Norwegian that Alma did not understand, but recognized by its tone as approving. Martha made a sound beside him. Henrik was on his feet, and he turned to Alma, and she had been steady and controlled for 2 weeks, and through the entire hearing, and she was still steady now, but the steadiness had a different quality. Thinner, lighter, like something held taut for a long time, and finally allowed to breathe. That was, he said. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, wide open, in a way Henrik Carter's face almost never was. Alma. That was, "It's not over," she said, because it was true, and because she needed something to say that was not. I know. I know I can see your face. The investigation still has to run, but he won't touch the creek. Not now. No, Henrik said. He won't. He put his hand over hers on the table. It was brief, a moment only, and then he lifted it away. But it was the first time he had touched her deliberately with intention, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat between them all the way back to the boarding house and all the way home to the ranch. Gerald Calhoun, as it turned out, had miscalculated in one fundamental way. He had assumed that a man alone on 300 acres in Yellowstone County was in fact alone. He had not accounted for the woman who had arrived on the Northern Pacific in late May, with 2 suitcases and a violin and a set of terms he would have considered absurd if he had known to consider them at all. The investigation took 6 weeks. It found that Aldous, the county recorder, had accepted payment from Calhoun to file the fraudulent correction. Aldous lost his position. Calhoun faced a civil action from 3 other property owners in the county, whose land he had acquired through similar methods in the years prior. The investigation into Henrik's case had, as Alma had quietly anticipated, opened a door that Calhoun had believed was sealed. 2 of those 3 property owners got their land back. Henrik told Alma about the civil action on an evening in late September, when the air had started to carry the first real cold of the coming season, and she had made soup from the last of the summer vegetables. He read the letter from the county attorney's office aloud at the supper table, slowly and carefully, the way he read everything, and when he finished, he set the letter down and looked at her and said, "You knew this might happen. When you raised the prior knowledge point, you knew it might open more than just our case." She ladled soup into his bowl. "I suspected," she said. "Why didn't you tell me?" She set the pot down and sat across from him and met his eyes steadily. "Because if I had been wrong, it would have complicated things, and I did not want you to carry the weight of a possibility I was not yet certain of." He looked at her for a long time. "You were protecting me," he said. "Not an accusation. Something quieter than that." "I was being practical," she said. "Alma." She looked up. "You were protecting me," he said again, gentle, certain. She held his gaze and did not argue. After a moment she said, "Perhaps, yes." He nodded slowly. He picked up his spoon. He ate, and then quietly, without looking up from the bowl, "Nobody's done that in a long time." She did not ask how long. She did not need to. She understood with the precision she brought to everything that mattered exactly what that sentence held. The 6 years of silence, the winters alone. The letter written at a table on a Tuesday night, because a man can only carry a certain weight by himself before he has to admit he was not built for carrying it alone. "Well," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "Someone is doing it now." He looked up. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the courthouse when the gavel came down open undefended with the full force of a man who has run out of reasons to look away. And this time, he did not look away. He held it. He let her see it. All of it, the gratitude and the confusion, and the something beneath both of those that neither of them had said yet, but that had been building since a train platform in May, with 2 heavy suitcases and a violin case and a list of terms in a coat pocket. She let him look. She looked back. The soup cooled. Neither of them noticed. It was the fever 2 weeks later that broke the last of it open. She was fine in the morning. At least she said she was fine, and Alma Brandt was not a woman who complained so. Henrik did not press. By midday, she was moving through the kitchen with a slowness that was wrong, and by afternoon she was holding the edge of the counter with both hands, and her face had gone the particular gray-white of someone fighting something their body is losing. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. He put his hand on her forehead and felt the heat of it, and said very quietly, "Go to bed." She started to say something about the bread she was making. Alma. His voice was not harsh. It was something harder to argue with than harsh. It was certain and full, and entirely without room for negotiation. "Go to bed." She went. He stayed. He covered her with every blanket in the house. He heated bricks and wrapped them in cloth and put them at her feet, the way his mother had done for him 40 years ago. He boiled water and made something hot with dried herbs he found in her kitchen stores, because she had organized the dried herbs into small labeled jars, and even sick, she had made it possible for someone else to find what they needed. He sat beside her bed. He waited. The fever ran 3 days. On the second night, it spiked badly, and she was not quite coherent. She spoke some German quiet and rapid things he could not understand, and he sat in the chair by her bed and kept the cool cloth on her forehead and changed it when it warmed and talked to her low and steady, because he had read somewhere or been told somewhere that the voice helped. That even when people could not follow words, they could follow the sound of a voice they trusted, and he wanted to be a voice she trusted. And so he talked. He talked about the ranch, about the fence line, about the cattle rotation, and how it was holding the way she had said it would. He talked about the first winter he had spent in Montana, how cold it had gotten, and how he had not been prepared for that particular kind of cold, the kind that was not just temperature but weight, a physical pressure the air took on. He talked about the letter he had written in February. He said to the woman who was too feverish to hear him clearly, "I wrote what I thought I needed. I was wrong about most of it. I was right that I needed someone, but I was wrong about the kind of someone, and I was—" He stopped. He changed the cloth. He held her hand for a moment to check the temperature of it. "I was not thinking about someone like you. I did not know to think about someone like you, Alma. I didn't know that was a thing that existed." She made a small sound. Not words. Just a sound. He stayed. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke sudden and clean, the way fevers sometimes break, and she opened her eyes in the gray early light and found him in the chair beside her bed, upright and awake, with the book from her shelf open in his lap, the one on European history, at a page he had been reading aloud to her through the night slowly and carefully, the way he read everything. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He closed the book. He said, "How do you feel?" She considered the question honestly, the way she always considered things. "Weak," she said. "Better." She looked at his face, the shadows under his eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who has not slept in 2 days, the book still in his hands. "Henrik, did you sleep?" "Some," he said. She looked at him. He looked back, and neither of them was going to get anywhere by pretending anymore. "You read to me," she said quietly. "All night." "Most of it," he said. "The history book. I don't know if you could hear it." "I could hear it," she said. She held his gaze. "I could hear your voice." He set the book on the floor by the chair. He leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked up at her and said, with the plain, unstudied directness of a man who has finally run all the way to the end of everything he had been holding back, "I ain't ordering a wife anymore, Alma. I'm asking." The room was very still. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall soft and soundless, and the light coming through the window had the particular quality of a world just turned white. She looked at him. This man who had built a shelf before he was asked to, who had stayed up through a fever night reading history aloud to someone who might not have been able to hear him, who had defended her to Tom Abernethy with a single quiet sentence and then never mentioned it again. This man who had opened his hand on that courthouse table for just a moment and then taken it back as if he had not yet earned the right to leave it there. "I know," she said softly. "I've known for a while." His eyes searched hers. "And?" She reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on his knee. She left it there. Steady, certain, entirely deliberate. "And yes," she said. Her hand stayed on his for a long time. Neither of them moved. The snow kept falling outside the window, and the room held its particular stillness, and Henrik looked at her hand on his with the expression of a man receiving something he had not allowed himself to want for so long, that the wanting itself had gone quiet, buried under 6 years of practical necessity and deliberate solitude. Now it was here, real and warm and entirely certain. And he did not know for a moment what a man was supposed to do with that. What he did was cover her hand with his other one, gently, the way he handled things that mattered. "You need to eat something," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. She almost smiled. "That is what you say, after I say yes." "You've had a fever for 3 days." He stood up. He did not let go of her hand immediately. He held it one moment longer, then released it with the care of someone setting something valuable down. "I'll make soup." "Henrik." He stopped. "The soup can wait 2 minutes," she said. He turned back. She was sitting up in the bed, still pale, still weaker than she would ever admit, but her eyes were entirely clear and entirely herself, that direct, unflinching gaze that had catalogued him from a train platform in May and had not stopped since. He sat back down on the edge of the chair. "I want to say something while I have enough strength to say it properly," she said. "All right." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I did not come here expecting this. I want you to understand that. I made my list. I had my terms. I was prepared to be useful and capable, and entirely separate the way two people can share a space without—" She paused. "Without it becoming something. I was prepared for that." "I know," he said quietly. "I was not prepared for you to build the shelf," she said. "I was not prepared for the soup or the courthouse or—" Her voice stayed even, but something in it deepened, became heavier with what it was carrying. "I was not prepared for a man who would sit up 3 nights reading history aloud to someone who might not even hear him." Henrik looked at the floor. "I reckoned you could hear it," he said. "I hoped you could." "I could," she said. Every word. He looked up. The thing in his face, that wide-open, undefended thing she had first seen in the courthouse and had not stopped seeing since, was there again, fuller now, with nowhere left to hide. "When I was a girl," Alma said, "my father told me that a person's character is not what they say about themselves. It is what they do when no one is watching and nothing is required of them." She held his gaze. "You have shown me your character, Henrik. Every day since May. I want you to know that I see it. And I am—" She stopped. She was not by nature a woman given to speeches about her own feelings, and this was costing her something, but she paid it. "I am glad of it. Profoundly." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I ain't a complicated man." "I know," she said. "That is not a deficiency." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so small and so careful that it was over almost before it registered, and then he stood up and said, "Soup," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and went to the kitchen. She listened to him move around out there. The familiar sounds of the fire being stoked, the pot being lifted, the particular domestic language of a man making something for someone he loves. And she lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and felt with her whole body the specific gravity of a life shifting permanently onto a new axis. She was 30 years old. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent. She had arrived in a place she did not know with everything she owned in 2 suitcases and her father's violin and 12 books and a folded list of non-negotiable terms. She had not come looking for this. But here it was. And Alma Brandt, who was above all things a practical woman, knew better than to argue with a thing that was real. They did not speak of it again immediately. This was not avoidance. It was the way both of them moved through important things, letting them settle and become solid before building on top of them. But everything between them was different now, and they both knew it, and the knowing was enough for the moment. She was back on her feet within 4 days. He had not wanted her up so quickly, and he said so twice, and she told him both times that she was not made of porcelain, and he said he knew that better than anyone, and that was the closest either of them came to humor about the fever, and it was enough. Christmas came on a Thursday that year. Alma had been planning it in quiet, private ways for 3 weeks, not saying much. Making small trips to her room with things she had found or made or modified from what the ranch provided. Henrik noticed. He did not ask. He had learned in the months since May that some things Alma did were best encountered complete, rather than in process. He came in from the morning feeding to find the cabin transformed. She had used pine branches from the trees at the north edge of the property, wired together into shapes he did not have immediate names for garlands and small hanging forms that smelled of cold and resin and something Alma-specific he could not define. She had found every candle stub in the house and set them in a line along the windowsill in small pools of melted tallow that held them upright. There was something baking in the oven that smelled like spice and warmth, and somewhere else, somewhere older than Montana, and when he stood in the doorway and looked at all of it, at the cabin he had built with his own hands, made into something entirely beyond what he had imagined it could be, he did not know what to say. Alma came out of the kitchen with flour on her hands and looked at him standing in the doorway. "Come in," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He came in. He closed the door. He stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, looking at everything she had done, and then he looked at her. "German," she said, simply gesturing at the decorations. "My mother did this every year. I did not have everything she had, but the principle is the same." "What's baking?" he asked. "Pfeffernüsse," she said. "Spice cookies, my grandmother's recipe. I had the spices in my stores." She paused. "I brought them from Chicago. I thought they might be wanted at some point." He looked at her. "You packed spices." "I packed things that mattered." She met his eyes steadily. "I packed for a life, Henrik, not just a arrangement." He stood in the middle of the room she had made into Christmas and understood in a way that landed somewhere below thought that she had known from the beginning, something that he had only been learning since May, that a life is not what you specify in a letter. A life is what you build from what arrives. He crossed the room. He took her face in both hands carefully, the way he did everything that mattered to him, and he kissed her. It was the first time. It was quiet and deliberate, and absolutely certain. And when he lifted his head, she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something, and is relieved finally to find it is exactly what she thought it would be. "Koselig," he said. He had been practicing the word in private since she had used it once weeks ago, talking about what a home was supposed to feel like. He said it badly with the flat vowels of a man whose tongue had never made those sounds before. But he said it. She stared at him. Something moved across her face that she did not try to stop a wave of something full and warm and entirely undone. Her eyes went bright. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you say," he told her. She pressed both hands flat against his chest. She stood that way for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Geborgenheit." "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means safe," she said. "It means warm. It means—" She searched for it. "It means the feeling of being held by a place and a person at the same time, of belonging to somewhere and someone truly." She looked at him. "I did not think I would find it here. I did not allow myself to expect it." "And now," he said. She looked at him. This rancher who had written a letter asking for quiet and had received instead someone who played violin and read Latin and argued about cattle and stayed up past midnight building a legal case by candlelight, and she said, "Now I am home." The circuit preacher came through in January. His name was Elias Marsh, a wiry man of 60 who had been riding the same Montana circuit for 15 years and had married people in circumstances considerably more unusual than this one. He came on a Wednesday, stayed for supper, ate 3 helpings of the black bread Alma had made, and married them the following morning, with the cattle making their ordinary sounds in the barn, and the violin propped in the corner of the room, and Henrik's 12-year-old copy of the Bible open on the table. It was not a ceremony with witnesses exactly, unless you counted Pete Birch, who had ridden over through 6 inches of new snow, because Martha Halverson had told him to, and because he was the kind of man who showed up when it counted. Martha herself stood beside Alma and held her hand during the vows, and cried in a way that she would later describe as entirely dignified. Henrik said his vows, the way he said everything that mattered, slowly, carefully, with the full weight of a man who does not make promises he does not intend to keep. When he was finished, he looked at Alma, and she looked back at him and said hers. In return, her voice steady and her eyes entirely clear. And Elias Marsh said the words that made it legal. And Eric Halverson, who had positioned himself near the door with his hat in his hands, cleared his throat and looked at the ceiling. After Alma made coffee and pfeffernusse, and they sat around the table, the 5 of them, Henrik and Alma and the Halversons and old Pete, and talked the way people talk when something real has just happened, and they don't want to leave the room where it happened quite yet. Pete told a story about a wedding he'd attended in 1861 that had been interrupted by a bear. Martha laughed until she had to hold the table. Henrik watched Alma across the room, the way she leaned forward when Pete got to the part about the bear, the way her whole face opened when she laughed, the way she was entirely herself in every moment, without performance or apology. And he thought I wrote that letter in February because I was alone and I did not know how to say I was lonely. And I did not deserve what I got for it, but I intend to earn it. Every day. For as long as she'll have me. He did not say this out loud. He was not a man who said things like that out loud. But he held it complete and certain, while Pete finished his story, and the coffee went around again, and the snow fell quiet and steady outside. He had 42 years to earn it. He used every one. They ranched the Carter land together through drought years and good years, through the brutal winter of 1886 that killed half the cattle in Yellowstone County, and the recovery that followed, slow and stubborn, the way recovery always goes out here. Alma's cold frames became a model that 3 neighboring ranches adopted within 5 years. Her cattle rotation, the method from the Nebraska man on the train, saved the herd through 2 dry summers that broke operations less prepared than theirs. When the County Agricultural Cooperative formed in 1891, they asked Alma to present at the first meeting. She did in the direct, organized way she did everything, and she was asked back every year for the next decade. Henrik built her a second bookshelf when the first one filled. He built a third one when the second did. By the time their eldest daughter Clara was old enough to read, there were 4 shelves in what had become organically and without announcement the family's library, a room that had started as a storage space and been slowly transformed into something else entirely, the way most things in that house were transformed, gradually and with purpose. They had 5 children. Clara came first in 1884, and she arrived into a house that already knew what it was, not a house built for quiet or for compliance or for the particular narrow version of life that Henrik had described in a letter on a Tuesday in February 1882, but a house built for exactly what it had become, loud with argument and music and cooking smells and Latin declensions recited by children at the supper table, because their mother believed that a mind well furnished was a person well armed. Henrik drilled them on fence repair and animal husbandry and the kind of practical knowledge that kept people alive out here. Alma drilled them on curiosity and precision and the absolute necessity of saying what you meant and meaning what you said. The 5 of them grew up knowing both kinds of knowledge, and every one of them carried it forward into lives built on the same foundation their parents had laid. The understanding that labor and respect and curiosity were not separate virtues, but a single one expressed 3 ways. It was Clara who found many years later in the strongbox under her parents' bed, while helping her mother sort papers, the original letter Henrik had written to the placement agency in Milwaukee. She read it at the kitchen table while Alma stood at the stove, and when she finished, she looked up and said, "Mama, he asked for someone quiet." Alma did not turn from the stove. "He did," she said. "And they sent you." "They did." Clara looked back at the letter. Someone should have told that agency they made an error. Alma turned then. She looked at her eldest daughter with the calm, complete expression of a woman who has known for 40 years exactly what she is worth. "They did not make an error," she said. "They made a correction." Clara looked at her. "Did Papa ever complain about the quiet he asked for?" "Once," Alma said. She turned back to the stove. "In the first week, he said he had specified someone not educated beyond what was practical." "What did you say?" "I told him that I was exactly as educated as was practical." She paused. He did not argue. Clara folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Do you think he knew? When you stepped off that train, that it would be all of this?" Alma was quiet for a long moment. The stove made its sounds, the house full of 40 years of being lived in hard and well settled around them. "No," she said finally. "He did not know. Neither did I." She looked out the window toward the north field, where Henrik was as he was most mornings doing the work that 67-year-old men on Montana ranches do, whether their joints object or not. But I think we both knew very quickly that what had arrived was better than what had been ordered, and we were both wise enough not to send it back. Henrik Carter died in 1925 in his bed, in the house he had built with his own hands, with Alma beside him, and 3 of his 5 children in the next room. He died the way he had lived, quietly, deliberately, without complaint, with his affairs in order, and his fences mended, and the woman he had not known to ask for holding his hand. Alma lived 11 years beyond him. She played the violin until she was 81. She read until her eyes would not allow it, and then she had her grandchildren read to her, which she said was better anyway, because it meant someone else was in the room. She gave the pine bookshelf, the first one, the one Henrik had built in the first week from the driest boards he had, to Clara when she married, because it was the first thing he had ever made for her, and the right place for it was in a house where people loved each other well enough to build things without being asked. She was buried in January 1936, beside Henrik on the north edge of the property 40 yards east of the Cottonwood Grove, inside the boundary line that she had argued for in a county courthouse in 1882, with 2 weeks of candlelit preparation, and the single most important question she had ever asked, in a room full of people who told you about the corrections before they were filed. The creek ran past them both the way it always had. The boundary held. The land stayed Carter land for 3 generations after. Some people come into your life the way you ordered, quiet, convenient, easy to accommodate, arranged to cause the least possible disruption. And some people come off a train in late May with 2 heavy suitcases and a violin and a list of non-negotiable terms, and proceed with complete calm and absolute precision to become the most important thing that ever happened to you. Henrik Carter had been wise enough to recognize the difference, and Alma Brandt had been brave enough to board the train, and between those 2 facts, a whole life was built, improbable, extraordinary, and more real than anything either of them had ever thought to want.